My name is Claire Gibbs and I'm a principal ecologist for Surrey Wildlife Trust Ecology Services, who I've worked for nearly 20 years now. And we're an independent ecological consultancy owned by the Wildlife Trust, and all our profits are returned to the Trust. So one of the greatest joys in my life over the last few years has been found in my garden, and more specifically, taking actions to encourage more wildlife into my garden and then watching it arrive. As soon as you take one step and then watch the outcome, it's hard not to get the bug and want to do more. Put up a bird feeder and birds will arrive. Take it a step further and put up a particular feed for a particular species you want to attract. For example, sunflower hearts for goldfinches, and that beautiful, delicate bird is very likely to appear. And that leap of joy when you spot one and know that they have come because of something that you have done is pretty incomparable. Introduce a pond and a whole myriad of species, frogs, newts, dragonflies, water boatmen, will all arrive on their own accord and will provide literally hours of interest on a sunny day, watching the antics of the aquatic species. Most ecologists agree that we are currently undergoing the 6th great extinction. Over 1 million species globally are threatened. Surrey State of Nature reports, which was published in 2017, found that more than 1 in 5 species are under threat, and 1/3 of species are lost or in decline. But our gardens can recreate the habitats that wildlife really needs. Things like wildflower meadows, which have declined by 97% since the 1930s and are now one of the rarest habitats in the UK. And ponds. There's been a massive decline in both the number of ponds and their quality across the country, and many freshwater species have been lost and are still declining. And a habitat that gardens lend themselves to naturally is the woodland edge habitat. Many of our favourite garden wildlife species originally lived in forests, but ever since the ancient Britons started farming, we've been chopping down our trees, grubbing up our woodlands, and generally reducing the woodland habitat. Although some tree planting has taken place, most of these are conifer plantations, which are relatively lifeless compared to a deciduous copse. And the woodlands that have survived have changed because we're no longer regularly managing many woodlands, for example, by coppicing the hazel. And unmanaged woodlands become very dark and can no longer support colourful flowers such as primroses, wood anemones and bluebells, along with all the invertebrates that they support. But our gardens, with an aesthetically pleasing mix of small trees and shrubs, varying heights of flowering plants and grassland, can create something that is similar to the woodland edge habitat. This habitat, the boundary between the woodland and other habitats such as grassland, is known by ecologists as an ecotone, and it's immensely valuable to wildlife because it supports a huge range of species. Chris Baines, the well-known wildlife gardener, refers to this woodland edge habitat as the wildlife bonus zone. There was a pivotal report for conservation published in 2010 by Professor John Lawton called Making Space for Nature. And this report changed the direction of conservation in this country. The report emphasised the need for more, bigger, better, and crucially, more joined up areas for nature. The importance of corridors and stepping stones to allow wildlife to move through the landscape became mainstream, and this is where our gardens can really come into their own. There's approximately 27 million gardeners in the UK, and the gardens make up more than 400,000 hectares which is an area greater than all the nation's nature reserves. And so there is loads that we can do, no matter how big or small your garden, even in a window box. So in today's talk, I'm going to take a brief look at some of the wildlife that you might find and be able to encourage into your garden. Starting at the bottom of the food chain with plants, and then looking at insects, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. And for each group, I'm going to give my top tips for how to encourage them into your garden. And then I'm going to finish the talk with my absolute top 5 tips. So plants form the bottom of the food chain in any habitat, and therefore they're the first things to consider when you want to encourage wildlife into your garden. So the first tip I'm going to give is the quickest way to get rid of weeds in your garden, and it's simply to call them wildflowers. The definition of a weed is just a wild plant growing where it is not wanted. But many of these species are very valuable for wildlife. There are loads of so-called weeds that can form a very valuable part of any wildlife garden. So I've picked my top 2 favourite plants, which are often regarded as weeds, but are great for wildlife. So this is the fence along one side of my garden, and it is covered in ivy. And it is hard to overstate the value of this plant for wildlife. It will shelter many invertebrates, which in turn will feed birds. Birds will also use it as shelter and a nest site. Perhaps the most useful value is that it's a late flowerer, and its small yellow flowers are invaluable to pollinators late in the season when there's not many other flowers around. So species such as wasps, hornets, bumblebees, honeybees, and butterflies such as peacock, small tortoiseshells, and red admiral will all feed on the flowers of ivy. It even has its own bee, the ivy bee, which feeds almost exclusively on its flowers. The ivy bee is a new arrival to the UK. It was only first recorded in 2001, and it's slowly spreading north. And the ivy in my garden, in this picture, has loads of these bees feeding on the nectar every autumn. They look quite similar to honeybees, although they're a little bit larger. And then its berries during the winter are really important for birds, such as blackbirds, thrushes, wood pigeons, but if you're lucky, winter visitors such as redwings. The berries offer some of the last available sustenance for hungry birds during the winter, when other berries, such as hawthorn and rowan, are long gone and the ground is still too hard for birds to find worms. So it's interesting that although the berries appear in November, the birds don't actually tend to eat them until later in the winter. So they start by eating the shorter-lived berries, such as rowan and hawthorn, and they leave the longer-lasting ivy berries until last. According to the OSPB, ivy berries contain nearly as many calories as Mars bars, gram for gram. And in the winter, insects will also hibernate within the shelter of ivy. And it doesn't deserve all the bad press that it can get. It's not actually a parasite, as many people think. It only gets support from its host. One thing to bear in mind if you're encouraging ivy into your garden is you do need to give it time to get established, because it will only flower when it's mature. And my second so-called weed that I wanted to talk about was the dandelion, named after the French dent de lion, meaning lion's tooth, which refers to its toothed leaves. And dandelions are commonly demonized as one of the most pernicious weeds, but Personally, I think they are quite beautiful, and they're often the first flower that we see in spring and the last in autumn. But their peak flowering is from late March to May, and that's when many bees and other pollinators are emerging from hibernation. And each so-called flower actually consists of up to about 100 florets, and each one of those is packed with nectar and pollen. So this is really a lifesaver for pollinators in the spring. Bumblebees, solitary bees, and honeybees all visit dandelions for food, along with hoverflies, beetles, and butterflies, such as the peacock and holly blue. And also birds such as goldfinches, house sparrows, and bullfinches love pulling the clocks to pieces and eating the seeds. So my top tips for plants are: number one, embrace the weeds. Don't automatically pull up that ivy climbing up the fence or those dandelions in the lawn. Could that weed actually be something quite attractive and valuable for wildlife? This picture is my garden, and it's showing a carpet of lesser celandine, which many people would view as a weed, but I think looks absolutely beautiful in the spring. Number two, cut the lawn less often. Maybe mow a little less frequently, say every 4 weeks, and this will allow the wildflowers such as buttercups, cat's ears, clovers, spursfoot trefoil, daisies, and dandelions to grow and flower between the mows, providing a buffet for the pollinators. And Plant Life are promoting a no-mow May, and they found that just not cutting the lawn in the month of May can result in enough nectar for 10 times more bees and other pollinators. And if you remove the cuttings, the nutrients in your lawn will decline and wildflowers will increase further. And number three is consider creating a wildflower meadow. If you've got an area that you wouldn't mind turning into a meadow, just leave it unmown and just mow once in late summer or autumn. Remove the cuttings, and this will become a real oasis for lots of types of wildlife. If you find there's not a lot when you leave your lawn to grow long, you could clear an area and strip the turf off the top and sow with a wildflower meadow mix in the autumn. And as well as providing food for pollinators, areas of long grass also provide seed for birds such as house sparrow and goldfinch, and shelter for small mammals such as hedgehogs and voles. It doesn't have to look unattractive. The key is to make it look intentional, not neglected. So you could create a circle of long grass around a tree, or you could mow neatly trimmed paths through a meadow area with neat edges, or you could potentially leave an area to grow long in an area that you don't see, such as behind a shed. And a mix of different grass lengths is best, including very short areas for species such as mining bees. And I'm going to talk more about plants, both native and non-native, in the next section, which is going to focus on insects. So there's been a lot in the press recently about the decline of insects, and recent studies paint a grim picture of the decline of insects across the planet. A well-publicised review recently concluded that current rates of decline could lead to the extinction of 41% of the world's insect species over the next few decades. So David Attenborough summed up the situation when he said, "If we and the rest of the backboned animals were to disappear overnight, the rest of the world would get on pretty well. But if invertebrates were to disappear, the world's ecosystems would collapse." Luckily, insects are something that we can very easily encourage into our gardens. And if you get the insects in, everything else will come in to feed on them. So in this picture, this is a black and yellow longhorn beetle, on an oxeye daisy, which I photographed in my garden. And it's mimicking the colours of wasps. And it's a very common and, I think, attractive garden visitor. So let's talk about pollinators. This is a species group that we can definitely help to encourage into our gardens. There are at least 6,000 species of insect pollinators just in the UK, and that includes bees, butterflies, moths, beetles, wasps, and flies. And like other types of insects, they are declining fast. Around 250 UK pollinators are in danger of extinction. But research by the University of Bristol in 2019 found that residential gardens and allotments are pollinator hotspots. And in fact, they had 10 times more bees than parks, cemeteries, and urban nature reserves. So my number one tip for pollinators is to provide a variety of garden flowers. Not all flowers are valuable for pollinators though. So many plants that have been bred to make them look attractive are not accessible to pollinators. So for example, plants with double or multi-petaled flowers may not have nectar, or the insects may have trouble accessing them. So native plants are great, as we know that our native wildlife has adapted to them. They tend to be the most accessible to our pollinators, and also they're best adapted to our climate and soils, and are therefore less effort for us to look after. But there's no need to stick only to native plants. The RHS has done some excellent research on this in recent years, and they concluded that any planting in a garden is better than none for invertebrates, and diversity of plant origin in a garden is a strength, not a weakness. So they have combined all their knowledge and produced an excellent resource, which is called the Plants for Pollinators database. And this is freely available on the internet. And they've selected a range of year-round flowering plants of known benefit to pollinators, including both natives and non-natives. And it includes hundreds of plants, everything from native plants such as forget-me-nots, ragged robin, and purple loosestrife, to non-natives such as French marigold, dahlia, and Japanese anemone. And they have plants for every season and soil type. Which brings me to the next point, which is to include a variety of plants which flower across the season. So there's something for pollinators throughout the year. And also it's important to include plants with a variety of different shaped flowers. So different pollinators have different tongue lengths. So for example, the garden bumblebee is a long-tongued species, and it feeds on species such as honeysuckle. The early bumblebee is short-tongued and needs more open flowers, as do hoverflies. This is a lovely example of a pollinator that needs an open flower. So this is the thick-legged flower-beetle, which I photographed in my garden in the summer. This is a male, and I think he's really impressive. I think he looks a bit like a superhero with his metallic green cape and muscly looking thickened hind legs. But they're actually quite common in the gardens of southeast England, and quite easy to attract to open flowers such as oxeye daisy, bramble, and kale parsley. But I think it's a real treat to find one of these in your garden. So my second tip for pollinators is to provide some messy areas and areas of bare ground, because it's not just flowers that pollinators need. They also need somewhere to lay their eggs. And many species need specific plant species for this purpose. Nettle, for example, is a very important egg-laying site and food plant for the larvae of some of our most beautiful butterflies. In full sun, it will be used by red admirals, small tortoiseshells, peacocks, and comets to lay their eggs on. And pollinators may also need things such as grass tussocks, hollow plant stems, and compost heaps. Some bees also need bare ground for burrows. So tip 3 is to introduce some water. Water is really important for pollinators too. For example, many types of hoverfly have aquatic larvae. So this is a picture of Helophilus pendulus, which I took by the edge of my pond. Its scientific name means dangling marsh lover, and it's also known as the footballer hoverfly due to its handsome stripy thorax. But for me, it reminds me of a humbug sweet. And it's a very common species in this country, so keep an eye out for it if you are able to introduce some water to your garden. So tip 4 for pollinators is to put up a bee hotel. Solitary bees are a really easy group to encourage into your garden, even in urban areas. Unlike bumblebees and other social bees, each female makes her own nest and there are no workers. However, many females may nest in close proximity to each other. Different solitary bees use different nesting materials and sites, but they all need some form of cavity. And this could be in the form of hollow plant stems, holes in tree stumps, or an artificial habitat, such as a bee hotel. And she will lay each egg in an individual cell, separated by walls built out of whatever material that species favours. And then each cavity will be filled with enough nectar and pollen to support the development of the larvae. So there are many shop-bought versions of bee hotels available, or you can easily make your own, and there are lots of guides available for this on the internet. And they're a great way to replicate the small holes that many solitary bees and wasps need as nesting sites. And they're great fun to watch as they become colonized. You can even just drill some holes of varying sizes into an old tree stump. I got my husband to drill a few holes into an old tree stump in the garden, and within literally a few days, I photographed this handsome bee investigating. So, two species that you're very likely to attract into a bee hotel are the red mason bee, such as this one here, and leafcutter bees. So the red mason bee, the female lays eggs in hollow stems and then seals them with mud. And if you have a bee hotel, you may see them flying to and fro carrying mud or pollen. And then there is the amazing leafcutter bee. These are incredible bees that cut little circles out of plants and glue them together with their sticky saliva to create miniature nests in which they lay their eggs. And you can look out for their characteristic holes in garden leaves, especially roses. And pollinators are definitely not the only important invertebrates to think about. Deadwood invertebrates, for example, are vitally important to our ecosystems. They are nature's undertakers. This is a group of invertebrates that are really struggling in the wider environment, mainly due to our fondness to tidy up. And it is one area where gardens can really help. We can't talk about deadwood invertebrates without talking about the magnificent stag beetle. You might see its slightly ungainly flight on a warm summer's evening, or dig up one of its large white grubs while gardening. It's our largest land beetle, and obviously the males have the very characteristic antlers. But this most majestic of creatures is really struggling. and it's classified as nationally scarce. They're continuing to decline and have even become extinct in a couple of European countries. They spend most of their life underground as larvae. So they can spend anywhere between 3 and 7 years underground. Then once fully grown, the larvae will leave the rotting wood they've been feeding on, and they'll build a large cocoon in the soil where they pupate and then finally metamorphose into an adult. The adults spend the winter underground in the soil and usually emerge from mid-May onwards to mate and reproduce. And you can see in this picture here, I actually was lucky enough to see stag beetles mating halfway up an ash tree in my garden. Once they've mated, the females return to the spot where they emerged, and if there's enough rotting wood to feed their young, they'll dig down into the soil to lay their small round eggs in rotting wood, such as log piles, tree stumps, and old fence posts. And then by the end of August, most of them will have died. And that is why they're in trouble. It's getting less and less common for buried wood to be present, and importantly, left undisturbed for the required length of time, up to 7 years, for the larvae to mature to adulthood. So my top tips for invertebrates are: number 1, create some deadwood piles. It's really easy to create deadwood piles around the garden with garden waste. And as well as supporting invertebrates, they will become hunting grounds for a range of wildlife, including small mammals, birds, amphibians, and reptiles. Tip 2 is make a bug hotel. This is another great way to help a range of invertebrates, and they can be big or small. They're relatively easy to make, and I think make an interesting feature in any garden. And it just involves putting together a range of materials, including sticks, dead wood, bark, old plant stems that insects can use. And a whole ecosystem can evolve in the larger ones, including predators and prey. And this is one that we have in our garden, and I just top it up with appropriate garden waste whenever I think of it. And tip 3 is you could have a go at making a stag beetle loggery. It's actually really easy to help stag beetles in your garden. This is a stag beetle loggery that I created in my garden, and it's just a number of old logs buried halfway up their length in a hole. And I also put a few shorter logs around them buried under the ground. You can also create a stag beetle bucket, which is just basically a bucket buried in the ground with approximately 3 parts wood chip to 1 part soil. And my absolute final tip before I leave insects is don't poison them. Insects can be really helpful to us if we start working with them rather than treating them as the enemy. So if you can avoid the slug pellets and pesticides, the beneficial insects will slowly build up and start to control the not so welcome guests. Wild areas will support loads of great predators, such as ladybirds, lacewings, ground beetles, and hoverflies. And these will in turn control the population of less so welcome insects, such as greenfly and blackfly. And it could take a year or 2 for the balance to establish, but it is worth being patient. Even wasps predate small insects, which they feed to their young. I read the other day that by the end of the summer, a wasp nest may have consumed up to 250,000 insects. And then garden birds, and if you're lucky, hedgehogs, will help to control slugs and snails. And once a fully functional garden ecosystem is in place, everything should stay more or less in balance. So, birds. They are arguably the most charismatic of our garden wildlife and probably the most loved. Amazingly, approximately half of all UK householders feed birds. And feeding birds is often people's first steps into the joys of wildlife gardening. So this list shows the top 10 birds found in our gardens, as recorded in the RSPB Garden Bird Watch 2020. And the RSPB Big Garden Bird Watch is really fun to take part in. It's the country's biggest bird survey, which takes place every year. And it just involves looking out into your garden during a specified weekend during the winter and recording what birds you see for an hour. And the survey is providing really valuable data on how our birds are doing. And what it has found, unfortunately, is that there has been a serious countrywide decline in the numbers of many birds. So the data shows that numbers have dropped dramatically since the Birdwatch began in 1979. So house sparrows are down 53%, starlings are down 80%, blackbirds are down 46%, and robins 32%. But this is another area where we can really help in our gardens. So different birds have different requirements, and the features that you have within your garden and the food that you put out will affect what birds you get. For example, blue tits and great tits and sparrows may be popular on your feeders, while dunnocks, song thrushes and chaffinches will hop around on the ground below the bird table. If you live in a wooded area, you may be lucky enough to see great spotted woodpeckers, nuthatches, and coal marsh and long-tailed tits. Look out for blackcaps too, because they're becoming regular visitors to some bird tables in the winter. And thrushes will visit your garden if they have fruit and berries to eat. Insect-eating birds such as wrens are unlikely to visit bird tables, but they'll stick to the undergrowth. But their loud, trilly song is unmistakable. And we all love the UK's favourite bird, the robin, which follows you around in the garden looking for worms. And with a bit of patience, these can even be persuaded to eat from your hand if you offer some juicy mealworms. And of course, there's the goldfinches, which to me are an absolute delight. And I've been putting out Niger seed, which is the recommended food for this species for many years, and I'd get the odd couple every now and again. But it's only since I've been putting out sunflower hearts that they've really flocked to my garden on a regular basis. And goldfinches will also eat seeds left on flower stems over the winter. They'll often feed on old lavender stalks. And I've recently introduced some wild teasel to my garden, as they're said to love the seed heads of that plant. You may even see sparrowhawks visiting your garden in search of prey. These are the top avian predator that regularly visits the garden. And they're actually a sign of good garden health because they indicate that there's enough food available for them to survive. And they help to maintain the health of songbird populations by ensuring that only the fittest songbirds survive. They only take what's needed, with meals often being days apart. So birds, they're not just lovely to look at, they're great predator controllers. Many birds, such as robins, wrens, tits and house martins, help to control insect pests. Song thrushes feed on snails and are well known for smashing them against suitable stones to shatter the shells. And many, such as house sparrows, eat aphids and feed aphids to their young. Also, seed-eating birds such as chaffinches, greenfinches and sparrows can help reduce the seeding of weeds. So my top tips for birds are: number one, provide natural food. The best form of food for them is in its natural form, so provide lots of seed and berry-bearing plants, and importantly, allow the insects to thrive in your garden. Number two is provide water. Water is essential for birds, both for drinking and bathing in. It's particularly important during the winter when natural supplies may be frozen, and in dry, hot weather during the summer when water can be hard to find. Birds have no sweat glands, so they need less water than mammals, but they do lose water through respiration and in their droppings. And most small birds will need to drink at least twice a day to replace the lost water. And bathing is also really important so they can keep their feathers in good condition. Even if you've got a pond, they will also really appreciate a separate bird bath where they can be higher up and away from predators, and also they can clearly see the depth of the water. You don't have to buy a bird bath. Even an upturned dustbin lid with a few rocks or stones in will do the job just as well. Number 3, supplementary feeding, which is particularly valuable in the winter and early spring, but it is helpful to do throughout the year. And number 4, provide shelter and nest sites. Again, natural is best, so include as many trees, shrubs and hedges as you can. But bird boxes are also useful, and you can buy many different types, or there are also lots of templates you can follow on the internet to make your own. So different types of bird boxes include simple boxes like this with a small hole at the front, and they're suitable for species such as blue tits and great tits. Boxes with an open front like this one are good for robins or wrens. You can also buy or make terraces for sparrows because sparrows like to nest communally, and numerous other boxes for different species, such as this one, which is for swifts. Okay. So amphibians is another group which can really benefit from gardens. Introduce a pond to the garden and amphibians will make their own way to it. You'll be amazed at how quickly they manage to find it. So frogs and toads are the most recognised visitors to our gardens. But do you know the difference between a frog and a toad? So frogs have green wet skin, green eyes and a black eye patch, but they can be very variable in terms of coloration. They have long legs that are generally banded, and they tend to hop and lay clumps of spawn. An average female frog lays about 2,000 eggs, of which only about 5 will survive to adulthood. Common toad has a dry, warty skin, amber eyes, and they vary in colour from dark brown to brick red. And they have shorter legs and they tend to crawl rather than hop. And they lay ribbons of spawn rather than the clumps of frogs. And toads tend to be more faithful to their traditional breeding grounds than frogs. So you're less likely to attract them to a new garden pond. And that could be why they are struggling. And they've declined by 68% over the last 30 years. Another common visitor to garden ponds is the newts. And there are 3 native newts in this country. So the first one is the common or smooth newt, and this is the most likely newt that you will find in your pond. They're the most widespread of the British newts, and they're very good at colonising garden ponds. They have an orange belly, which is covered in black spots, and they have a pale throat, which is also spotted. Then there's the palmate newt, which is the smallest of our native newts, slightly smaller than the common newt. The best way to distinguish this from the smooth newt is that the palmate newt's throat is not spotted. And also, the male in breeding condition has a filament at the tip of the tail. And it also has skin between the toes, between the rear toes. And palmate newts, they prefer more acidic water. So they're often found on heathland, in ponds on heathland, moorland and woodland. So if you live near one of these habitats, you could be lucky enough to get one in your garden. And then this handsome creature on the end is the great crested newt, also known as the warty newt. And this one is much bigger than the other two. It's about 15 centimetres long with a warty skin. And they're sort of a grey-brown in colour with black spots. And they have fine white speckles. They also have thin bands of yellow across their toes. In the breeding season, the male displays a superb dorsal crest and also shows flashes of white along the centre of its tail. And this species is actually protected by law due to the declines in its population throughout its European range. And therefore, if you think you have them in your pond and need to do any major work that could impact them, it is best to get further advice. And all these three species of newt will lay their eggs on narrow-leaved water plants, and they'll place an egg and fold the leaf up around it. So my top tips for amphibians are: number one, include a pond. Even if you only have space for a small one, that is absolutely fine. Even just a washing up bowl stuck into the ground could well attract frogs and smooth newts. Ponds aren't just good for amphibians, they'll attract a whole range of wildlife, including insects, birds, reptiles and mammals. And it could well become the wildlife focal point of the garden. Ensure that at least one side of your pond slopes to a shallow area to allow wildlife to enter and exit safely. And if this isn't possible, add a ramp or stones and rocks so the animals can climb out. Also, if you can, steer clear of introducing fish into your ponds because they will eat frog spawn and tadpoles and lots of other wildlife. And don't attempt to bring frogs or other wildlife from another site to your pond. The amphibians are brilliant at finding ponds themselves. And if you transport them yourself, you can spread diseases or invasive plant species. So number two is provide terrestrial habitat. Amphibians they only live in the pond during the breeding season. So outside the breeding season, they will come onto land and use a variety of habitats within our gardens. And they seek out damp places such as under logs, stones, leaf litter and wall crevices. So log piles and piles of stones near to the pond will be much appreciated, as will a cover of native plants in and around the pond edges. If possible, don't mow the grass right up to the pond edge. And number three, encourage the insects. When they're on land, the amphibians feed on insects, slugs and worms. So as well as providing shelter, the log piles and stones will also attract prey. And amphibians will help you by keeping insect populations in check. So reptiles. If you're lucky, you may have reptiles in your garden. It may depend on what habitats you have near you and whether they're in your area. I don't have any in my garden, unfortunately. The most likely reptiles that you may see in your garden are slowworms, common lizards and grass snakes. If you live near suitable habitat, you possibly may get an adder, although it is unlikely. So slowworms, they're actually legless lizards, and they get to up to 40 centimetres in length. And they can be brown, copper, golden or grey. They may have dark brown sides and a thin stripe along the back. They've got a small head and a very shiny body with a blunt tail. And you'll normally discover them hiding underneath objects. The common lizard, this can get up to 14 centimetres in length, and it has light and dark spots, flecks and stripes on a brown-grey background. They can be very variable though, and the young can be all brown or black. And these you'll often see basking out in the open on rocks and wood piles. And then there's the grass snake, which is Britain's biggest snake, and it can reach over 1 metre in length. And this has a background of olive green, brown or grey, and it has a very distinctive yellow marking on its neck with next to a black mark. And these are normally seen in or near ponds or basking in a sunny spot. And then the adder, which is unlikely to have in your garden, but it is very identifiable by its zigzag, which runs from its head to its tail. You do occasionally get entirely black adders, and they are normally seen basking in sunny spots. So my top tips for reptiles are: include areas for basking and sheltering. So log piles and areas of long vegetation are great. You can also put out artificial refugia, which will create warm spots for reptiles to bask on or under. So these can be squares of old carpet, corrugated metal, or bitumen roofing sheets, and reptiles such as grass snakes or slow worms will go under these in the mornings to warm up. And it's a great way to discover what you've got in your garden. Tip 2, have a compost heap. If you can avoid the closed plastic types and use simple piles or slatted bin styles instead, then wildlife can access. And grass snakes will lay their eggs in compost heaps, as the warmth is ideal to incubate their eggs. And slow worms also love their warmth, and the reptiles can also forage there for invertebrates. Think about where they could hibernate, and it's very easy to build a simple hibernaculum for reptiles by digging a hole in a sunny spot, filling it with logs and branches, bricks, rocks, with plenty of gaps in between, and then cover the pile with soil. And then if you want, you can seed it with meadow seed on the top. Again, don't use pesticides, encourage insects, because slow worms and common lizards eat insects, spiders, small snails and slugs. And include a pond, because although grass snakes will eat small mammals, they're also very good swimmers, and they'll take a variety of amphibious prey, such as frogs and newts and even small fish. So the final group that I'm going to talk about are the mammals. And mammals are a great fun group to encourage and watch in the garden. There's many mammals that could come into your garden, including mice, voles, shrews, squirrels, rabbits, moles, badgers, fox, deer, as well as the less welcome rats. If you've got a good habitat, you might even get weasels and stoats. And I love this picture that I caught on my wildlife camera of a badger drinking from my pond. And bats will also frequently roost in trees in our gardens or in our roofs. And they can frequently be seen feeding over gardens, particularly if there's a good invertebrate population. Seeing bats in our gardens on a warm summer's evening is a magical experience. I was so excited when I caught this bat feeding over my really quite small pond in my garden one night. And judging by the size of its ears, it looks like it's probably a brown long-eared bat. All bats are insectivorous, and the most common one that we would see, the common pipistrelle, can eat 3,000 insects in a night, including midges and mosquitoes. So they're pretty handy to have in the garden. And I'm going to focus a bit on hedgehogs because this is a species that is really struggling and we can help within our gardens. It's Britain's only spiny mammal. As a distant relative of the shrew, they've changed little in the past 15 million years. They're generalists, so they can be found across a wide range of rural and urban habitats. But data suggests that we have lost over half of our hedgehogs from our countryside since the millennium alone, and have lost a third from our towns and cities. Gardens provide hedgehogs with a plentiful supply of food, as well as potential nesting sites for breeding and resting and hibernation. For these reasons, urban areas have become a stronghold for hedgehogs in recent years. And hedgehogs have home ranges of between 10 and 20 hectares in size. They can roam an average distance of 2 kilometres on a single night. They may need to visit between 20 and 30 gardens a night just to find enough food. And male hedgehogs in the breeding season travel even further. We now know that one of the main reasons why hedgehogs are declining in Britain is because our fences and walls are becoming more and more secure, reducing their ability to travel through the landscape. You might have the perfect habitat for hedgehogs within your garden, but if they can't get in, it won't be much good. So to help urban hedgehogs, gardens need to be linked up so they have sufficient area to roam. And you only need a gap of approximately 13 by 13 centimetres at the bottom of a fence to let hedgehogs through. And this will tend to be too small for most pets, so hopefully you won't get your neighbour's dog coming in. So my top tips for hedgehogs are: number one, allow access to and from your garden. Number two, create wild areas, including log piles, leaf piles, overgrown areas. And these will provide areas for breeding and hibernating, as well as supplies of insects for them to eat. Number three, compost heaps can be attractive nesting sites. Number four, a pond will offer much needed water supply, as well as attracting insects and amphibians, and hedgehogs will actually occasionally eat frogs. Don't use slug pellets, let the hedgehogs do the job for you. And you can also create a purpose-built hedgehog home, and these can be bought or made yourself, and there are plenty of guides on the internet. This is one that I made in my garden just from some bricks that I sourced off Freecycle and a couple of old paving slabs. And I haven't actually seen a hedgehog in my garden. I don't think I have them. We do have quite a lot of badgers, which may be putting them off. So I thought it was worthwhile building this home, as you know, it could provide them with some shelter, and maybe they will come into the garden. So everything that we've looked at today is quite easy to view, but it's estimated that 90% of our garden wildlife is invisible to us unless you really look for it. So by helping these charismatic species that we can see, we're also helping a whole range of species that we can't, and helping to maintain a healthy ecosystem. Often, really small changes to the way we manage our gardens, and often involving less work, can make a massive positive impact for wildlife and the enjoyment that we get out of our gardens. So you might have noticed as we've gone through this talk that there's a lot of repetition as to what is good for one species is often good for many. So here are my top 5 tips for creating a wildlife-friendly garden. Number 1, introduce some water. It doesn't need to be a big pond, even a washing up bowl, buried and filled with water, will draw the wildlife in. Number 2, be less tidy. leaf piles, log piles, piles of stone, accessible compost heaps, vegetation left uncut over the winter provide really important habitats for a whole range of species. Number 3, leave some grass long. You don't have to leave your whole lawn long, but just an area of longer grass, and perhaps mowing the lawn a bit less often will be greatly beneficial. Number 4, introduce lots of different plants flowering throughout the year and with different flower shapes. And number 5, avoid using pesticides and slug pellets and let a natural, healthy ecosystem develop. And there are loads of resources available free on the internet. A good place to start is the Wild About Gardens website, which is a joint initiative between the Wildlife Trust and the RHS. And this has got loads of great information, lots of downloadable booklets on particular topics, including the new Bring Back Our Beetles leaflet. And also both the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB websites both have sections with lots of simple guides for making things such as bee hotels, bat boxes, hedgehog homes, reptile and amphibian hibernaculums. And Surrey Wildlife Trust have also just launched their new wildlife gardening survey, which is a very simple survey and it just takes a few minutes and you can find out how your garden scores for wildlife, along with ideas for how to improve. And you can opt in to sign up for more tips and advice by email. And once you've entered, your garden also gets put onto an interactive map, which you can investigate to see how other gardens in your area are doing. Also really useful is a Surrey Wildlife Trust, the Surrey Wildlife Gardening Facebook group, and you can pick up loads of good tips from there. So my final tips are spread the word. The more people that take small actions for wildlife, the greater the benefits will be. Surrey has more than 20,000 hectares of gardens, which cover 12% of the county. And this is more than all of Surrey's nature reserves put together. So they are vital to the survival of our wildlife. Just imagine the positive impact we could make if everybody just did one thing for wildlife in their garden. Working together, we can create stepping stones of wildlife habitat along streets, throughout towns and through the whole of the UK. And enjoy watching. Don't forget to stop and watch. Research shows that gardening and being in touch with nature brings enormous benefits to physical and mental health. And in my mind, there's few things in life that can match the mindfulness and awe that can be gained by watching the wildlife just outside your door. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire. That was absolutely brilliant. I've hosted loads of these talks and it's the only one that I've actually been writing notes from. So it's absolutely brilliant. Thank you. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in already, so thank you very much. And if anyone hasn't asked a question yet, if for instance someone has already asked your question, then please do you can upvote on the questions that have already been asked, or you can just type in your question again. I'm going to start off with a question that was emailed to me just before the talk, actually. Claire, I won't ask my question on ponds because you've already answered it so beautifully in your presentation. Thank you. Right, the question from Chris. Any recommendations for an organic alternative to slug pellets that won't harm wildlife? I have one visiting hedgehog through, though he suspects he prefers the hedgehog food I put out. That's a really great question, Chris. Actually, I would actually be interested to know, obviously you have mentioned obviously alternatives like getting predators to help with the situation. If you could maybe elaborate a bit on that. And also, are there benefits to putting out hedgehog food? I know that's a very basic question, but should we be doing that, or should we be more encouraging the natural things that they should be eating?
Yeah, I mean, I always think that natural is best. So encouraging the natural habitat is definitely the best, in my opinion. And also, if you put less hedgehog food out, I guess they probably will eat more of the slugs for you. But I don't think there's any harm in. I think it can attract them into your garden. So, but with the controlling the slugs, so yes, try and get as much wildlife in your garden as you can, because slowworms, frogs, toads, hedgehogs, birds, they'll all eat the slugs. Also, you can put some things like you can put beer traps. So if you just get a pot and dig it into the ground, have it sort of a couple of centimetres above the soil so you don't get ground beetles and things falling in. Fill it with beer, and then the slugs hopefully will fall in there and have quite a nice end. And then you can also put barriers up, like eggshells, crushed eggshells, sharp sand, ash. There's lots of different things you can try. And something that I found really successful for plants that are in pots is if you get the copper wire that you can get from garden centres, because if the slugs or snails go over that, they get like a little electric shock, and that's been really successful for me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Claire. I've used copper wire before, the tape before, and it's actually really, really effective. Really useful. Right, I'm going to move on to some of our questions on the Q&A. So forgive me while I sort of peer through my glasses. Christine, fascinated to hear about the ivy bee. This was right at the beginning of your presentation. It was absolutely amazing. I agree with you, Christine. Do we know where they originated from?
I am not sure. I guess they've come from Europe and are moving north as the climate is changing and getting slightly warmer.
Fantastic. Well, if anyone knows, pop it in the chat, or sort of feel free to Google us. It sounded fascinating. I'd love to do some more research into these ivy bees. Wonderful. Right, someone else asked, is it true that dandelion is edible?
Yes, yeah, you can eat the leaves in salads. Yeah, I can't say I've tried it myself, but
brilliant.
I think it is actually meant to be quite healthy for you. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, let us know what it's like, Nicole. It would be lovely to know. Perhaps we can put it in our sort of wild breakfast menu for 30 Days Wild. Another couple of questions from Christine. Why do gardeners have so many more pollinators than parks, etc.? And she's also asked another question, just following on from that, if we can segue into that. I put a bug hotel about 2 years ago on my fence, but I'm not sure if I've had any guests. Any ideas what I could be doing wrongly? You're not doing anything wrongly. That you've put a bug hotel up. That's brilliant.
It may be. If it's a bug hotel, if it's like a bee hotel on the fence, then it needs to be in the sun. It needs to be pointing the sun. So sort of pointing south. If it's shaded, then that might be why it's not being used. The first question, I think our gardens are better for pollinators just because there's more flowers and there's more different types of flowers. So rather than in a park, which is mostly sort of grassland and shrubs. So that's probably why.
Brilliant. Thank you. Great questions. Christine, I did the same last year, put a sort of a bee hotel up, and I've put it up too low, completely in the wrong place. There's me saying there was no wrong. but I definitely put it in the wrong place. I will be moving that this year.
Same with bird boxes. You've got to think about where you put them. So bird boxes are the opposite of bee hotels. So bird boxes, you don't want to face them south because they'll get a lot of sun then, and they'll overheat. So
that's another thing I did wrong then. Write this down in my notes. Brilliant. Right, the next question. Sorry, there's so many questions. I was sort of just trying to scroll down. A second. Actually, while we're on the subject of dandelion greens can be eaten raw or cooked and contain vitamin E. A, C, and E, folate, iron, B vitamins, and calcium. Wow, thank you, Louise. So yes, Louise gives a big thumbs up to eating dandelions. Wonderful. Right, someone's asked, do I need to clean out my bee hotel? And if so, when and how? Oh gosh, that's a really good question.
Yes, I think you do, because once they've filled up their little compartments, they'd need to be cleaned out. But you'd have to do it at a certain time of year so that you weren't disturbing the larvae. So they'll be coming out sort of in the spring. They'll be hatching out in the spring. So probably if you needed to clean it out, do it sort of in the spring before the new eggs get laid. But you probably wouldn't need to do it very often, because I wouldn't have thought they'd fill up all the holes in 1 year. So maybe every couple of years or something.
Brilliant advice. Thank you. I'll see what happens to mine next year when I move it into the correct position. Right, Lou's actually asked another question on the subject of bee hotels. She read that you should bring bee hotels into a shed over the winter. If this is the case, how do they survive in the wild? That's a brilliant question.
I've never heard of doing that myself.
Lou, where are you getting your information from?
I don't know. Yeah, it's not something that I'm aware of. I think you can leave them out. Yeah, because in the wild they'd be out in the winter. So.
Yeah, interesting. Well, sorry, Lou works with us, so forgive me for being a little bit cheeky there. I'm not usually this cheeky. So Lou, let us know. Let's do some research on that. That would be really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I definitely don't know everything, so I'm happy to learn.
Wonderful. Right, we have another question from Nicole. What is good for spider mites to keep them away?
I would say other animals, other insects, bigger insects. Yeah, just that's quite a hard question. Yeah, I don't know. Don't know is my answer to that one. Apart from a healthy ecosystem that can sort of keep everything in balance.
Brilliant. More predators. Wonderful. And more questions coming in. Do feel free to ask more questions while you're here. Right, Steve has asked, we usually started to see frog spawn in the pond by now, and none has appeared. Is it a bit early, or can we do something to encourage that? This is a brilliant question. I know you mentioned something about it in your talk earlier.
Yeah, it has normally appeared by now. I mean, it has been a really cold spring, hasn't it? So it could be that some have held off, and you'll get some later as it warms up. It could be that you've had some in there and it's been eaten, if you've got newts or something like that in your pond. Yeah, I can't really suggest any way to encourage it other than just to maintain a good pond habitat.
Oh, so sad. Oh, I hope you find some. Right, another question. What habitat is favoured for ladybirds to breed? That's a brilliant question. Thank you, Chris.
Ladybirds to breed. I think just any sort of wild areas are good for that sort of thing to breed in. You can buy special ladybird houses as well, but I think get us back to sort of the messy areas of the garden. If you can have lots of messy areas, then lots of things like ladybirds will be able to breed.
Brilliant. Well, at least that's one thing I'm doing right, the messiness. Right. One of the last questions for the moment. Bumblebee Conservation Trust says to do it to protect larvae from the damp. So that's where you were mentioning it earlier, Lou, about moving it into sheds.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's brilliant. So I mean, it's something to look at, definitely, and it's always lovely to be sort of engaged with these things and to learn new things. I don't, maybe it's lockdown, but this year I've definitely been more engaged in finding out more and getting curious about why someone's saying something about bringing your bumblebee homes or your bee homes into your shed. Let's find out why and share that information. And as Claire mentioned earlier on the Facebook group, the Surrey Wildlife Gardening Facebook group, brilliant place to share information as well. So I don't have any more questions at the moment. Apart from, well, I'm going to revert to the conversation we had earlier, Claire, about my tiny little pond. This weekend, I finally submerged my daughter's sand pit into the ground and created a tiny little pond. It is very small, so realistically, how can I really maximize the impact for wildlife in that pond? Because it's really not very big. So any tips on that would be really gratefully received.
Okay, so did you say that you had planted some things in the pond?
I've got oxygenating plants and some gravel, and around the sides I've got long grass, and I've left some weeds and then stones in there as well. So I have noticed birds actually going in already and sort of trying to get to the bottom and see what's around, which is brilliant. But yeah, anything I can do to maximize the potential of that pond would be great.
So leaving the long grass like you said you're doing, that's really good. If it's relatively deep, you should try and make sure that there's an escape route for animals. So if you've got some like a ramp or some way that they can get in and out safely, that will be really good. Also, like thinking about the area around the pond, maybe having a log pile or a pile of rocks and stones, that will be great for all the aquatic life when it comes out onto land.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll be out there again this weekend. I love my job, get so much fantastic information from my colleagues. Wonderful. If anyone's got any more questions, now is your time to ask, and one's just come in. Is it okay to feed bread to birds in the winter? That's a brilliant question, because I've heard differing views to that, and then the decision's been reversed and stuff like that. So Claire, can you shed any light?
From what I've heard, it's not the best food to feed them. I think it's a bit like us eating fast food all the time. It's probably okay every now and again, but it's better to feed them sort of grains and seeds and mealworms and that sort of thing.
Brilliant. Well, there you go. You've had it from our expert there. That's great. And Chris is saying, top up my pond with rainwater. Thank you, Chris. I was out there in the garden with an old nappy bucket and other buckets just catching rainwater. Water butt is on the next list. So if you are going to make a pond in your garden, however small, plan it just before it rains. Brilliant timing. Thank you, Chris. All right, no more questions coming in at the moment. So I'm just going to take this opportunity to say we have lots and lots of events coming up over the next 2 months now. So if you do want to learn more, Lou, who has been listening in this evening, will be doing a talk on greening your streets. So she and one of her colleagues, Kirsty, has been engaging with her neighbours over lockdown and getting a bit competitive and trying to sort of make those sort of connections stronger for nature, as Claire referred to earlier. It's all very well having this amazing garden with sort of lots of incredible things for wildlife, but if the wildlife can't get to it, then there's going to be a bit of an issue there. So it is about connecting up nature. Yeah, sign up to come to the Greening Streets talk. We've also got a talk about hedgehogs and earthworm ecology. We've got connecting nature through hedgerows and beetles. So lots more. And as Claire said, take part in the survey because there's some really useful tips that are sort of coming through there if you want to get more sort of tips on how to improve your garden for wildlife. Right, I have had one more question in saying from Steve. Thank you very much, Steve. You mentioned about keeping undesirable insects away, I think. What would this include, please?
Does he mean what insects are undesirable, or?
I'm not sure. Steve, if you could clarify, that would be great. Sorry. I can't remember hearing anything about that. But
yes, the most undesirable insects are things like the aphids and the green and the black fly. And the best way to control them is to get their predators in. So the ladybirds and the wasps, and also all the some of the birds and things. So just get a balanced ecosystem if you can.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That actually reminds me of the coffee morning we had the other morning. Someone mentioned they had a bit of a phobia of flying ants, and everyone has their own opinion on insects. And someone came to the rescue with basically get a pond, for instance, because if you have toads in your pond, they love flying ants. And someone told a very funny story about seeing this massive sort of swathing sort of movement of flying ants sort of crawling around the place, and this toad just sitting there and getting very, very fat by the end of the day. So there is a predator for everything.
Yeah.
And Steve's just clarified, actually, he said, sorry, yes, what do you want to keep away was my point. Oh, that's it. Very new to this. As am I, Steve. We're in this together. We're all learning.
So you obviously don't want lots of aphids on your plants because that's going to reduce the health, and also slugs, and there's lots of things that will munch on your plants. So, but the best way, as we said, is to get the habitats in place, and then the predators will come and control them naturally, hopefully.
Brilliant. And there's so much you can do, and do take a look at the website, Steve, because there is just so much you can do to encourage wildlife and predators of all sorts into your garden. I remember one of our old colleagues, Kate, making lacewing homes from Coca-Cola bottles, I believe. So there's just tons you can do. So yeah, just challenge yourself, see how much you can do, and post photographs and send them to us on Facebook. We'd love to know how you're doing. Wonderful. Right, I have no more questions at the moment, unless anyone else would like to ask a quick question while we're here. I don't know if anyone knows, but Claire is one of the judges for the Gardener's World Wildlife competition. Claire?
Sorry, you froze there. I don't know if that was
Oh,
me
no.
or you who froze.
I think that might have been my internet access. I was just saying that you are one of the judges for the Gardener's World competition.
Yes. Yeah, so that's a very exciting new opportunity. So I'm on the judging panel for Garden of the Year for Gardener's World with Alan Titchmarsh and a couple of other judges, and that's because Gardener's World, they've really realised the importance of encouraging wildlife into gardens and how much it means to people and is growing in popularity. So they want to include the ecological side of things in that competition. So that's really exciting.
It's absolutely, we're so thrilled still. And Claire keeps forgetting this, so we keep reminding her how brilliant she is. It's absolutely fantastic. Right, I have no more questions. Just a few comments on the chat saying thank you for all the great info. Claire, you were brilliant. Tough act to follow. That'll be from Lou. So yeah, we'll quiz Lou when she does her Greening Streets talk. I'm sure that will be equally as brilliant. So with that, I'm going to draw this evening to a close, and massive thank you to Claire. That was just so educational, and I can't believe I've written notes as well. It was just absolutely brilliant. Gave me a lot of food for thoughts, and a lot of potential food for wildlife. If all of us take action, that would be brilliant. So thank you all for coming. I see some of you are sort of regulars for our online talks and coffee mornings, and members and volunteers. So thank you for your continued support. There are quite a few new names today. Someone from the USA is watching as well, which is really exciting. So hello everyone new out there. Thank you for your support. And obviously, if you would like to do more to sort of help wildlife, there are so many ways you can, by getting out in your garden, encouraging your neighbours, going on this massive learning journey with us as well. We have a fantastic adult education program that does lots of courses for wildlife beginners, how to get the best out of your pond, bat ecology, and all sorts. So you can geek out on wildlife to your heart's content with our adult education program. And obviously you could volunteer or become a member of Surrey Wildlife Trust. We usually give coffee mornings for free, and we do free walks for members when obviously we're allowed to post-lockdown. So there's lots of benefits as well as you're supporting wildlife. So thank you once again. More lovely comments, Claire, saying thank you very much. That was great presentation. Very interesting, and have a lovely evening, everyone, from one of our attendees. So without further ado, I'm going to sign off. Thank you again, Claire.
That's okay.
And hopefully see you all soon at a future event. Get out there and get wild in your gardens. Night, everybody.